My name is Martin Bunton. I'm the acting director at the Center for Global Studies. I'm filling in for the director, Oliver Schmidtka, while he is on a 6-month research leave that wraps up any day now. It's been a real privilege to be at the center. Let me start by acknowledging that the university is situated on the traditional lands of the Coast and Strait Salish peoples. And I recognize this also as a way of really affirming the importance that the Center for Global Studies does put on building its, on the role of the Canadian Indigenous peoples in its program. And really building on and valuing Indigenous peoples at the center is so clearly reflected also in the work of Rod Dobell, whose work we come to pay tribute to today. I've known Rod for over almost 20 years now, but the last 6 months as acting director, I've had even more opportunity to come to him with questions and looking for advice and conversation. Please know what a privilege it is for me to be able to acknowledge that and thank him here in this space. I learned long ago that you may have some issues or problems and you thought you'd talk to Rod and you didn't so much look for answers as just way better questions. And that's been a huge contribution to my own work. I study modern Middle Eastern history, and there isn't a book that I've published that doesn't acknowledge Rod in it in terms of the importance that he's had in my own work. So thank you, Rod. May I also acknowledge here, I see Barry Caron in the audience, and I think Gordon Smith will be coming too at some point, to acknowledge Gordon Smith as the first director of the center and Barry Caron as its associate director, who really were present at the center for the formative years and really put the place on the map in terms of being an engaged and international center. At the forefront, really, of the study of international global networks and economic governance, especially the G20. So thank you, Baron, and thank you. Thanks to Gordon when he arrives, too. Lastly, my main task really is to introduce Ted Parson, who will chair today's panel discussion. Ted, too, has been a valued member of the Center for Global Studies for many years. He comes to us today from the University of California, Los Angeles, where he is the Dan and Ray Emmett Professor of Environmental Law, as well as the faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And to his remarkable list of publications on his CV, which truly is amazing, with award-winning books and publications in the most prestigious journals, he now can add editor of this wonderful contribution as well. So thank you very much, Ted.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for that kind introduction, Martin. Let me add my welcome and my thanks to you for coming. As Martin mentioned, I've had the pleasure for the past few years of leading the project whose completion we're here to celebrate today, in conjunction with the launch of the resultant book, just published a few weeks ago by McGill Queen's University Press, A Subtle Balance, Expertise, Evidence, and Democracy in Public Policy and Governance. Books on sale here. Thank you, Miles. $30 cash or check only. A substantial discount floated by the Center for Global Studies. Get your books and you can get Rod to sign them. This project from the start has had two aims. One was to honor the contributions to Canadian public policy scholarship and practice of our friend Rod Dobell, whose career progressed from his early days doing mathematical economics and dynamic optimal growth theory at MIT and Harvard, through being a founding member of the Institute for Policy Studies at the University of Toronto, extended periods in public service, including leading the planning branch at the Treasury Board Secretariat and then the economics division at the OECD, to the presidency of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, and to a long and distinguished academic career here at the University of Victoria, with service on many advisory and policy-making bodies interspersed between these more regular jobs. In the quality, breadth, and diversity of Rod's contributions, he really has been a model of a phenomenon which is too rare in Canadian public life, of a distinguished scholar and thinker who is also willing to move into the fray, into positions where he's had to grapple with practice, with process, and with the responsibility of the real power that public decisions wield. So that was one of our aims. The project was a Festschrift in that it was organized around a reflection on Rod's contribution, but we were determined from the start not to make it one of those dull and sentimental ones. And so we made sure to assemble a group of extremely thoughtful and interesting people who have deep experience both in practical engagement in public policy and scholarly commentary upon it. And with this wonderful group, we reflected upon a set of large-scale trends and enduring challenges and questions about how to make good public decisions, how to create processes and institutions to promote good public decisions, and how these challenges have played out in practice in Canadian federal policy since the 60s. This is, of course, a broad landscape, and yet within it we found a few prominent themes. We had extended reflections upon the challenges related to the spatial scale of governance issues, and in particular the challenges to national governments that increasingly are forced to manage issues whose spatial scale ranges from the very local to the global. We reflected on the enduring tension between democratically elected institutions and the increasing tendencies toward more direct processes of decision-making that have more elements of direct democracy, now seen in the prominence of consultative and stakeholder-based processes embedded within electoral democracy. And most prominently, and that's why it's in the title, we reflected on the enduring tension between two aspirations for public decisions, that they be based upon the best available expertise, knowledge, and data, and that they also be fully democratic, representing faithfully the will of their citizens. This tension, expertise and democracy, it's like what they say at the weddings. It's something old, something new. It is ancient and yet utterly current. You see it resonate from Plato through John Dewey to heated conflicts in this week's newspaper over areas as diverse as climate change, fossil energy development, policies toward addictive drugs, management of the healthcare system, and related questions of the responsibilities of public servants being pulled in two directions, and attempted control over public comment by government scientists and other experts. The project explores these questions in various policy areas, first in a two-day workshop held here at the University of Victoria, and then in the edited volume that we're launching today. I'm delighted to see several chapter authors from the edited volume with us here today, as well as several participants in the extremely rich discussions that we had at the workshop. The questions that we addressed in the project map very closely onto the questions that have animated Rod throughout his career and on which he's made a long series of important, serious, and wise contributions. Because of this happy coincidence, which wasn't entirely coincidence, we had the good luck of being able to use Rod, indeed to wring him not dry, he would never run dry, but to wring him nearly dry in several different ways. In addition to being the honoree, I took to joking that Rod was the everyman of our Pilgrim's Progress, in a sense that his career and the evolution of his interests basically tracked with remarkable precision the progression of the most interesting and important conflicts and questions as they evolved over the 40-year period that we are considering. I can't tell you how many times over editing the volume an author came to me and reported that in exploring some issue or some development as part of their work, they had discovered that Rod was there before them, both in person and also as a thinker, addressing the same issue that they were grappling with now with his characteristic wisdom and elegant writing. And what Harry Swain once said to me of Rod, his exquisite intellectual taste. Finally, Rod, of course, was a highly engaged participant in the project, and indeed his own essay that appears late in the volume, reflecting on his evolving views on expertise and the responsibility of public servants, was called by one reviewer for McGill-Queen's Press a magisterial synthesis after which there was really nothing more to say. And so I recommend, says the reviewer, that you simply dump the editor's concluding chapter by that fellow Parson. So, the press treated that advice as advisory. The project's completed. We have a great book to sell. We're here to celebrate its completion, launch the book, and thank and honor Rod for his contributions. Now, this is the second time we've done this. We did it in Ottawa 3 weeks ago, and when we did it there, we had a wonderful panel of speakers who commented on Rod's inspiration and influence on their careers in the 1960s and 1970s. Today, we have an equally wonderful panel of speakers whose experiences with Rod are of more recent vintage. And I have to say, I wish you all could have the experience that I've had of sort of doing this twice and seeing these two snapshots of the influence and the contribution of Rod, because it gives a perfect picture. There are people now aged from their 20s to their 70s who have had similar memorable experiences of how they benefited from their contact with Rod. From his ability to find something of interest and value in everything, no matter how preliminary or ill-considered it might be. From his insights into the deep connections across disparate areas of inquiry and practice, and from his unfailing enthusiasm and generosity. So today we have 4 speakers, each of whom has promised to be very brief. I'm going to introduce them each in turn. We're going Kelly, Astrid, Justin, Nicole, right? Okay. So first, Kelly Bannister. Kelly is trained as an ethnobiologist. She's interested in collaborative and cross-cultural research, particularly in the ethical and legal issues that are related to research involving Indigenous cultural knowledge. She now serves as the co-director of the UVic Polis project on ecological governance, housed at the Center for Global Studies. Kelly, please join me.
Thank you, Ted. It's a great privilege to be standing up here up front, and I only have 7 minutes, but I'm going to take 8, so I'm going to cut right to the chase here and refer to my notes. I met Rod in the fall of 2000 as he was finalizing a SHIRK grant application, and he was proposing to establish a creative new partnership between UVic's School for Public Administration and the Clayoquot Biosphere Trust. And it was designed to link, this is a quote, link traditional academic research with community-based research and community-driven education and training initiatives. And at that time, I was a newly minted PhD, fresh from the botany department at UBC. And with my colleague, Catherine Barrett, we came to UVic to take up a postdoc position with Michael McGonigal at the Polis Project. And the work that we were funded to do was part of another SHIRK project called Coasts Under Stress, headed by Rosemary Omer. Catherine and I were interested in how academic research could more meaningfully address real social and environmental problems of relevance and priority to communities. So we were assessing whether the European Science Shop's model of community-based research had any potential in British Columbia. And we planned to use Clayoquot Sound as our pilot, our field site, to pilot the idea and to try to get some feedback from potential contributors and users in local communities, and if of interest, to set up Canada's first science shop at UVic. We saw a natural convergence when we were encouraged to discuss this with Rod, and Rod incorporated our science shop's endeavor into his SHIRK grant application. We were thrilled to collaborate for a number of reasons, not the least of which were to be able to benefit from some of the synergies between our two projects in terms of his connections in the region, as well as a budget that he wrote in for our project so we could actually travel there and meet with the people that we wanted to talk with. So we were able to do that regularly over the years thanks to Rod's generosity. And little did I know at the time that this was only the first of many enabling spaces within the Ivory Tower that Rod would create for junior academics like Catherine and myself, as well as for non-academic community colleagues and First Nations elders and others for years to come. Rod is an important space maker within the Academy, and he has not just opened doors for others, but he has used his status and capital to renovate the university in important ways, congruent with our values and commitment to meaningful community-university connections. Rod and I sat down early in our collaboration to figure out what should we actually do, what kind of project could we collaborate on. We could see how messy this community-based research stuff was and how important it was to have a clear understanding of not just the topic of research, but how we should be working together in ways that were mutually beneficial, not one-sided. We determined that what was needed and was a better understanding of the protocols of engagement, some kind of clearer guidance on how UVic researchers and Clayoquot communities, including the Central Region Nuu-Chah Nations, could work together in a good way. And it's important to note in that regard that at that time there was no community engagement written into the strategic plan of UVic or any other Canadian university. It was not even a trendy phrase that was used. There was no Office of Community-Based Research at the university. There was no specific funding, let alone requirement by SSHRC for knowledge mobilization. There was also very scant ethical guidance found in our national ethics policy for working with Aboriginal and local communities. So we were in the frying pan, figuring out as we went along and wanting to do the right thing if only we knew what that was. So therein was born what we called the Protocols Project. It was envisioned as a 2 or 3 month kind of endeavor, a pre-research exercise to meet with First Nations, community groups, businesses, government and others in Clayoquot to articulate how we should work together. This idea came into reality, as you'll recall, Rod, on a scribble on a napkin as we shared a pear cider pondside at the University Club not far from here, and that became our office and the place of a lot of further ideas over the years. Our 3-month project evolved necessarily into an 18-month endeavor and resulted in a formal standard of conduct of research in Northern Barclay and Clayoquot Sound communities. And it represented the work of many people and organizations and was formally endorsed by the local Nuu-Chah Nations. And for several years it served as very good guidance for researchers and in helping us understand how to work better with the local communities. That work went on to inform research ethics policy changes at UVic and national ethics policy changes to the Tri-Council policy statement. In support of the exploratory work on science shops, we teamed up with then Masters in Public Admin student Janet Dennett, whose work involved a comprehensive assessment of UVic's current and potential capacity to facilitate community-based research in her 2004 thesis entitled University and Community Linkages at the University of Victoria Towards a New Agenda for Community-Based Research, which was pivotal in the creation of UVic's Office of Community-Based Research, which then became the Institute for Studies and Innovation and University Engagement. Rod is a risk taker, someone who has the courage to not just talk about wicked problems, but to truly go forth into the messy unknown of what does it really mean and what does it really take for university researchers to work in meaningful partnership with diverse communities. We learned that sometimes the small things need paying attention to. Like feeding people. If you're going to ask them to meet with you, and you should be compensating them, feeding them, gifting them as a token of appreciation for their contributions. And these small things are easily overlooked by the Academy as we follow our big ideas. And in the past, these kinds of things were not typical budget line items in SSHRC grants. So I'm actually not really sure how Rod reconciled all his expenditures with SSHRC at the end of that project, because I know we spent quite a bit on food and getting together. But I do know that his generosity in that way and many other ways, and the risks that he took that were outside the box did not go unnoticed, and continues to contribute to our good relations with community colleagues to this day. It's no coincidence that much of my work over the last 15 years that I've known Rod has indirectly or directly involved Rod. I have actively sought ways to involve Rod or be involved in what he's doing. He is one of those rare contemporary Renaissance individuals who has something of value to offer to everything and to everyone. And it was last year at the Watersheds 2014 event in Cowichan that a realization about Rod struck me. He was asked to be a witness in Coast Salish style tradition for the event that we were at, and it was in the final plenary when he publicly shared his reflections that I realized something. I've had the great privilege to work with and learn from many Indigenous elders over the years who are important mentors in my personal and professional life. They've helped me understand that none of the important heady work that we do really can achieve its goal if it's not connected to the heart. Rod has come to our work not only with an open mind, but with an open heart and a generous, authentic spirit. And I can't read my writing. He is one of the wise ones, an important contemporary elder of academe, and one of the important elders in my world. Rod, for your roles as space maker, risk taker, and institutional innovator, I celebrate you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Astrid Pérez Piñán, a native of Puerto Rico, recently received her PhD in Gender and International Development from Trinity College, Dublin. She arrived in Canada in 2012, since which she has been a research fellow at UVic, first at the Centre for Cooperative and Community-Based Economics, then at the Centre for Global Studies, and is now taking up a new postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Women's Studies. Astrid, please join me.
Good afternoon. It's a true honor to be here. So I met Rod to begin with at the Center for Cooperative and Community-Based Economies, as Ted has just pointed. He was about one of the first people that I met, and geez, I had no idea that I was just meeting the right person for sure. He encouraged me to apply for the fellowship at the Center for Global Studies, and that's where I've been since 2013 until about 2 weeks ago. So at the time I was in the middle of my PhD, and I was researching what could possibly be a gender-sensitive way of developing indicators to measure the effectiveness of foreign aid. And so the latest international agreement had been signed on that, and there was no mention of gender or human rights. And so my task was basically to develop a set of indicators that were gender-sensitive and that could be practical for use at the policy level. And so in typical fashion, I began considering some of the global gender indexes that people know about, and that could provide what I thought was a much-needed gender dimension to this agreement. And then some of the issues, of course, that I began encountering and the questions that I was having, it turned out were also similar to questions that Rod was asking in other realms. I was more specific to foreign aid. I had no idea that he was about to write this chapter, but this book wasn't the making or anything. It was just simply, oh, how great that this person who knows so much has these questions, and that I can have the luxury of discussing them with him. And so some of the issues and the questions that arose from that research and that we talked about can be sort of summarized in a few things. Firstly, it was sort of that tension between the need for global direction from these kind of international agreements, but then also to have local relevance, that it could be specific enough that will be useful at the local level. So also there was the need to measure the unmeasurable. When we're talking about gender equality, we're talking about a multidimensional set of issues. We're also talking about lots of dynamics. This is not a linear approach that we can take to measure such issues. Composite indexes weren't going to do it either. So that was measuring the unmeasurable was a big topic in my thesis, and certainly the subject of some conversations with Rod, and especially some of these issues when important data is missing. A lot of the things that we need to know to be able to count what matters just is not something that we record. So how do we do that in a context-specific manner, and in a way that is applicable to a global agenda? Is that really possible? So those were some of the questions that I was grappling with. And now, using a gender-sensitive approach also involves conducting democratic participatory processes to capture the diversity of voices. What sort of democratic process could produce such measure in a way that drew from the best expert knowledge, while also drawing from local, new ways of knowing, in particular when it comes to indigenous cosmologies, completely new ways of knowing that are not in the mainstream? How do we do that? And what criteria shall be used to ensure a good balance, this subtle balance that the book explores? So there was that tension between what Ted described as the expertise and democracy, and it's teased out in the book. And it was an ongoing question throughout my thesis. So Rod, of course, takes some of these questions and takes them to levels that I couldn't have imagined in his chapter, so I encourage you to read it. In terms of his influence on my research, now that I have moved on from the thesis and I'm on to different projects, I always have this little voice that says, what will Rod say? Because there were times where I enthusiastically would have shared a piece of research that I thought, oh, this is an entry into these indicators. This is something that that could be a good balance, a good compromise. And then I find myself having this conversation with Rod around the difference between a feminist approach and a gender approach, right? So I kind of learned there, well, look, don't settle for half measures. Just be bold and go for what is right and what makes sense. And so in that sense, I would say that I could talk a lot about what things I learned, but I felt it was really symbolic the way that he gave me these 2 books on the last day of my fellowship in the center. One was Counting on Marilyn Waring, New Advances on Feminist Economics by Jorn Holt and McKay. And that said to me, or reiterated to me, this idea of do not be afraid of putting new language and new tools to things that are not there yet. Things are not going to change by keeping doing the things that we do just because it makes sense to us. We need to dare and venture to give new language and create new tools for the tasks ahead. And the next book he gave me was the one called A Political Space, Reading the Global Through the Local. And so that also gave me this sense of like, yeah, the local spaces, those messy participatory approaches that you were talking about, Kelly, are sites of important, happenings that are going to really inform the way forward. So go ahead and engage. So I could say a whole lot more about this, but I thank you so much, Rod, for your influence. I thank you for the constant open door in your office that always made it so welcome for us to have conversations anytime, and all of the encouragement that you have given me over the years. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Astrid. Next, I'd like to invite Justin Longo to the podium. Justin is the only speaker today who's actually a contributor to the volume whose completion we're celebrating. He has a wonderful chapter on the role of information technology in changing the notion of policy analysis and its relationship to government decision-making over time. Justin holds 3 degrees from the University of Victoria. Do they have a special name for that? At Boston College, they speak of triple eagles if you've graduated from the high school and the college and the law school. So Justin is a triple Vike, including a PhD in public administration, in which he was a longtime advisee of Rod Dobell. He's now just finishing a postdoc in the Center for Policy Informatics at Arizona State University, and next week he begins his new appointment as Cisco Systems Research Chair in Open Government at the Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. Justin, please try not to do any damage on your way to the podium, and please join me.
Thank you, Ted. I first started working with Rod in 1972.
The generation
That's a joke my wife doesn't find particularly funny. But in the intervening many years, I've learned more from Rod than I can remember. I've completed a PhD in public administration under his guidance, though, truth be told, he probably still doesn't quite think I'm ready to defend. And there's a lot more interesting questions to investigate. And it is my honor to continue to collaborate with him. When we have a revise and resubmit due in 2 weeks, remember? Don't forget. Okay. And what seems obvious to me, and I hope I can impress upon you, is how much of his insight, thinking, and guidance has influenced my current thinking about open governance. And you'll excuse me if I subconsciously oscillate between open government and open governance. I should know better, as I think the distinction is crucial, hinging on the distinction between openness within government institutions to computer-supported internal knowledge flows and collaboration, and openness as between the act of governing and the direct involvement of those outside government in those acts, again, especially influenced by computer-mediated interaction in the internet era. But while I study both open government and open governance, either and both of them succeed in raising eyebrows among the more skeptical, asking me essentially whether I've ever read the comment section in an online post. And I'll just clearly state that judging our capacity for open government based on our experience with what I'd call primitive online commenting systems that frankly seem purpose-built to me for allowing the lesser demons of our nature to shine through, would be akin to judging the safety of modern air travel based on pre-Wright brothers' failures to achieve sustained flight. Yes, we have a long way to go. We definitely need to get better at the systems we use for facilitating open governance. But this is where the work that Rod and Jody Walsh and I did in conjunction with Ocean Networks Canada to enable what we call science-oriented crowdsourcing through the Digital Fishers platform. This is where this is really instructive to me on what the future of open governance might look like. Still, you know, there's a lot of skepticism around the concept of open government. Look, I have 4 idiot brothers. You feel my pain? You understand. I also have 4 favorite sisters, which tells you more about my parents than me. But I have 4 idiot brothers who, when I try to explain that for both reasons of democratic legitimacy and policy effectiveness, we need to expand and improve the scope and scale of people involved in policymaking and governance, these brothers give me that look that only an older idiot brother can give you. And I should clarify, though, that I'm not only suspect, but I'm certain that all 4 of them refer to their 4 idiot brothers. And as the one brother that they all think doesn't actually work for a living, they reserve a special place for me in that panoply. But take, for example, my brother, the politician, someone working at the coalface of small-town public management. His is a world where, quote, you have to understand, I deal with these people every day, and most people aren't smart enough to be trusted with important decisions. Now, I've never been so impolite as to ask him to extend that logic to the process by which he got elected, to contemplate what it means that people who can't be trusted to make decisions elected him. But of course I'm being unfair, and that's because he's my idiot brother. Because some of my colleagues in the open government space, they speak in these code phrases that essentially say the same thing, phrases such as crowdsourcing wisely, not widely, and open governance to improve people's lives. I think they too have read the comments section, and I really get the impression that they think that open governance is okay as long as it's open to the right people, which is really just another type of closed governance. So how about it? Do we believe in open governance in practice as well as principle? Or is it like that old joke, I love humanity, it's people I can't stand? So this is how I interpret one of the underlying themes or tensions in the book that Ted has pointed to. It's a question of to what degree people can be trusted to be involved in this governance, and can that involvement be helpful? So I come to Rod's influence now on my thinking about open governance. As a former student colleague from way back, whose name I apologize is now lost to me, once said of Rod, I rarely understand what he's talking about, but he always knows what I'm talking about, even when I don't know what I'm talking about. which in many ways illustrates and points to what I've called in the past Rod's generous intellect. It was always remarkable how welcoming Rod is to discussing ideas with students, to considering new ways of thinking about things, to take the time to consider various perspectives and allow those who really weren't quite moving at the same speed of thought as him to enter the conversation as an equal. But the corollary of the above statement is that you will know what you're talking about when you leave. It just might not be what you were thinking when you entered. As I advised Jody when she started working with Rod and me, never go into his office without a notepad and at least 2 pens. So thank you, sir. Thank you for your generosity and your influence on my work, which has instilled in me a desire to bring that same type of generosity to the study of open governance, to believe that people are both capable and interested in being involved in things that matter.
Thank you, Justin. And now finally we're going to have comments from Nicole Bates-Eamer. Nicole holds a master's degree in international affairs from Carleton University, which she acquired after long and intensive experience in international development at the sort of ground level and in elite athletics. She came to the Center for Global Studies in 2008, initially as a research assistant working with Gordon Smith and Barry Caron, and has stayed on and worked in multiple capacities and contributed to multiple projects with pretty much everybody at the Center, certainly including those guys, plus Rod, Harvey Lazar, and now, to my great good fortune, me. Her current full-time job is that she is the manager for the SHIRT project on Borders in Globalization and the European Union Center of Excellence at the Center for Global Studies. Nicole, please come.
Well, according to the very strict timeline that we got, I have 2 minutes. So I'm going to time myself so I don't get carried away. Yeah, speak very quickly. So thank you, Jody. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Jennifer, for organizing. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I was humbled and honored. I think I actually said, "Are you sure you want me?" So I didn't really know how to begin or approach it. And I was anticipating a very high level of collective intelligence in the room, who were much better positioned to address the question of trends in Canadian public policy or commenting on Rod's chapter as we were initially tasked to do. So taking a page out of Barry's book, I said, I don't like that task. I think the task you should have given me is to offer my own reflections on Rod's incredible generosity to the Centre for Global Studies and the university, as I know it since 2008. So I first thought that I should devise some really sophisticated index that could be something like the Rod Dobell Impact Index or the Rod Dobell Influence Index. But none of those have great acronyms, and we all know great acronyms are really important in this type of work. So what I started doing was going through all of my emails. So searching Rod Dobell from 2008. There were a lot. But what I realized quite quickly is that taking an indicator or a measurement approach to this wasn't going to do it. I would take your own advice in matters that matter. In matters that matter, narrative trumps numbers, as you titled your piece with Jody on Marilyn Waring's work. So Rod and I have worked together I've worked with Rod both as an administrator and as a researcher. And I've learned 3 things doing research with Rod. One is that he's brilliant. So just like Justin says, you walk into his office, you sit down, you have a conversation, and you leave, and you think, what just happened? I thought we were talking about this, and now I'm thinking that, and wow. The second thing is that Rod does exactly what he says he does. He works collaboratively across the university. He is in meetings at University House 4, in these weird huts that are somewhere across the university that I don't know where they exist. And he is a connector. He is working with all different people, creating synergies across the campus that other people aren't. He is connecting the science and knowledge, the people, to make the right decisions and address the right issues. So it became so apparent to me when I was working with him. I was going through my emails and looking at what I'd done, and we did things on the Salish Sea. I was part of the Digital Fishers first iteration. We did something on North American futures. So he's working on all of these different things. I don't think he's getting paid for any of them. And he's just creating this space at the center that brings people together. But what really strikes me, and what I really wanted to talk about in my remaining 4 minutes, is the role that he's had at the center. He's been absolutely instrumental in its evolution, its survival, and its very iterations. And I think this largely goes unnoticed because his style and his grace and ability in which he works with people is very understated. So I think I recently said something about my heart's in Africa, but my head's in the system, and how do we make the system work for the people who don't have a voice. So quoting Nelson Mandela, one of my heroes, when speaking about a great leader, as a shepherd, he stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they are being directed from behind. And I think that is certainly the case with Rod at the center. One of the first things that I saw that we worked on together was a strategic plan. It was one of the various iterations of how does the center fit at UVic, how does research sit at UVic, and in an email from February 2009, when Rod was speaking about his vision for the center and the vision for research centers at UVic, he calls for bringing in as many of the regionally oriented research centers and groups as possible into Sedgwick, like CAPI, check, European Studies, check, the Africa group and the Latin America group. 2 out of 4 is not bad. There's also a wonderful opportunity here to bring in Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly's Borderlands work. Check. We should also talk with Martin Bunton, world history work. Check. And all of this will, now I'm quoting him, we will be turning all of Sedgwick into a seething mass of energetic research with lots of informal, non-administrative interaction, which would create a real center of synergies, synthesis, and exploration to fire both other academic research and student interests. I would say quite confidently that the Center for Global Studies is now doing that. But I just have to take this opportunity to point 2 of the reasons why I think that's happened. One is your ability to advocate on people's behalf. Kelly spoke about you bringing in Polis. I think that has been instrumental in creating a dynamic center. And the other one is that you brought in Jody. So on January 7th, 2011, I had an email, probably received while I was sitting on a beach somewhere, asking me to file the paperwork to appoint Jody. And thanks to your support of her, encouraging her to become the woman and the facilitator that she is, the center certainly has become that seething mass. So, I was thinking when the others were talking, the number of times that the word generous or generosity was spoken. Thank you for your generosity to all of us, to the center, your passion on the issues that matter, your ability to inspire greatness in people, and for making both the Center for Global Studies and UVic a wonderful place to work. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, all 4 of you. You did such a wonderful job. That's really fabulous. So now, as is befitting, as is the custom, after the toasts at a wedding reception, the bridegroom, or in this case, the honoree, has the opportunity of response. So, Rod, may I invite you to the podium for a few brief reflections and thoughts. And I promise not to cut you off this time as aggressively as I did in Ottawa 2 weeks ago, because I intuit that the audience is less restless today.
The audience is less restless. Well, thank you all very much for all your comments. It's obviously way more than I deserve. It has no foundation in fact, and I don't quite know how to deal with it. I was sort of thinking as I went along that Ted's introduction, sketching where I've been, and some of these comments, it's really the story of a man who can neither hold a job nor hold a thought. So I don't quite know where to go from there. But thank you all. And thanks to Ted and Jody for all the hard work that went into getting this book together and this book launched together. And because I don't quite trust Ted when he says he's not going to cut me off before my time, I prepared some really shortened text. So forgive me if I work rather closely from the text rather than talking more generally as I would like to. First of all, I've been extraordinarily lucky. I was born in the right place, in a very fortunate demographic niche, at a time of community solidarity, very strong desire for social justice. I graduated from high school at a time and in a place where I needed no thought and no luck and very little money to go on to university. I had wonderful teachers committed to their role as mentors both inside and outside the classroom. I graduated from university at a time when graduate school was accessible. I could choose among the best. I had the chance to go to MIT and took that opportunity. I left graduate school when universities were expanding to deal with the baby boom and rising rates of educational participation. And again, jobs were plentiful. My fellow students and I could have our choice. In the end, I was offered an opportunity to take up a postdoc appointment as an assistant professor of economics at Harvard on a 5-year appointment. So I started lucky in every way: demographic niche, locale, mentors, opportunities. And I'd like to talk just very briefly about the experience and the puzzles that those opportunities opened up. But before I go on, it has to be said that the biggest stroke of luck for me, the most important determinant in my well-being, was my great good fortune in overcoming the understandable reluctance and reservations on the part of the girl who's now been with me for coming up on 60 years, my wife Marnie. This is the real decision maker in my life. So I don't want to sound like an Academy Awards acceptance speech, but certainly I wouldn't be here at all without her influence and presence and support. To come back to the text, to skip over many pages, I came away from my post-secondary education with the conviction that, with minor reservations and ignoring a few practical considerations, the magic that associates the social evolution that led to free market trading of goods and resources, the association with optimal outcomes in the economic system and maximum overall welfare in the community, has surely got to be the right guide to public policy decisions. That whole analysis was eminently rational, or at least very rigorous, throughout. So that's what I thought on my return from Harvard to Canada to take up an appointment as associate professor of political economy at the University of Toronto. So again, cutting the story really short, things have turned out so that I had the academic experience at the U of T, very interesting. And then by sheer accident, half a dozen years at the senior management level in the Treasury Board of Canada and the Department of Finance Canada. And then a couple of years at senior executive level at the OECD. So the result of all that was to have driven very deeply into me how many more things there are in organizational life and decision than are dreamed of in my economics. But still, I'd not really come directly to grips with the long-standing tensions between reason and passion that are discussed in the book that we're here to launch and we hope you buy. So, following 7 years as director of the School of Public Administration here, after that overseas experience, I was offered 7 years as president of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, an outfit which has offices across, had at the time at least, offices across the big cultural divide that makes up Canada. With that experience of cultural diversity, I returned here to the Winspear Chair at UVic and to the first discussion of what became the Center for Global Studies. And by this time, attention in the world of policy analysis had begun to turn seriously, not just to the significance of the problem of uncertainty surrounding the application of economic thinking to public policy problems, but also to the underlying complexity and possibly the instability, the chaos of the many systems involved, including not just the social and cultural systems, but the fundamental ecosystems of the earth. So as I left MIT and Harvard, I knew a bit about the tremendously powerful body of statistical decision theory that indicates how a rational, self-interested person ought to make decisions under uncertainty. And then later in the early 1980s, I became aware of the influential work of Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, among many others, that demonstrated how risk perceptions differ very widely and how people systematically deviate from the rules of decision as laid out by the statisticians. Ted Parson and I wrote a bit about this sort of risk question while at IRPP. So there's no time to deal with it here, but of course, now we have all the work in reasoning research and neuroimaging that suggests the dual process brain, the brain with a fast, intuitive system one, leaping ahead with decisions, relying on heuristics, and displaying this very predictable distortions, but perhaps disciplined and constrained by the slower, more rational system two brain, offering the kind of rational decision model that I recognized from all these earlier studies. And then there's all the further work on motivated reasoning that suggests that even our slow reasoning brain is biased toward our initial instincts and motivated by social considerations. This brain's inclined to be skeptical of evidence that disagrees with our prejudices, and it's inclined to search further for information that discredits such evidence. It accepts readily anything that supports these pre-convictions. By now, we have a far better understanding of many factors that lead individually to such puzzling phenomena as climate denial or GMO hysteria. So much for puzzles and contradictions in individual reasoning. Much of this resolves some of these clashes between the instinct and the reason process. In moving from the individual decision to the collective decision, we face, of course, orders of magnitude more difficulty. For a while, it seemed to me that the social evolution had again generated the right structures, just as the magic of markets helped us to solve the problem of optimal allocation of resources. The political system into which I moved, totally innocent of any background in political science or governance or anything relevant, it seemed that the political system into which I was thrust was actually trying to develop a dual process democracy. And I actually haven't heard that phrase anywhere, but it seems to me that it may be the right analogy. It seems close. When I entered the public service, there was a story, the impression, coming just at the end of an earlier elite era, embodying what seemed a very good inside process that saw faithful appraisal and implementation of ideas flowing from constituencies through political parties into responsible parliamentarians and to an accountable cabinet served by a neutral and independent public service guided by leaders, mandarins, who are skilled in political economy more than politics, and providing the necessary reasoned discipline on the instincts and the ideologies of the politicians. But then the press for formal policy analysis, I've had to skip all the story about Mr. Trudeau coming to Ottawa and building up the apparatus of rational policy analysis, but the press for formal policy analysis and the growth of external polling capacity called that traditional governing structure into question. The growing clash between the politically appointed chief of staff in the minister's office and the deputy minister representing the advice of the neutral public service, attempting to constrain the political passions by reference to objective analysis. It does seem now highly symbolic of, that clash seems highly symbolic of the breakdown in this orderly dual process economy. Dual process democracy, indeed. So, or more generally, indeed, the institutional structure with a House and a Senate seemed to be a rather faithful replication of Danny Kahneman's System 1 and System 2. Sober second thought. Sounds a bit like the left brain coming in with reasoned caution to curb the excesses of the PMO working from the irrational means of the extreme base to create its instructions to parliamentarians. But in any case, that dual process democracy now seems to be coming apart under pressure from the outside, with the model of representative democracy giving way to ideas of participatory democracy or direct democracy as the era of post-war prosperity began to take hold, leading to the pressure for greater participation. And more recently, however, we seem to be seeing a descent into the chaos of a completely dysfunctional system in our increasingly secretive corporate state. So how do we get there? The argument I want to make very briefly is that the fundamental flaw now is the distancing of decisions from consequences, the delegation to an ostensibly rational decision apparatus, which is really divorced from consideration of context and from moral apprehension. It's now even divorced from legal liability, except in the most marginal of ways. With the introduction of speculative trading of paper claims, we're led to the concepts of property very far from the sweat equity of John Locke. And one of the things I was proud of in earlier academic work was to be able to demonstrate the instability of the trading process when you get to be trading paper claims in a speculative manner. That was something that Keynes knew long ago, but the mathematical models caught up with it later on. So a long and remarkable series of decisions has led to concepts of corporate personhood that are so powerful that all other forms of social organization or even individual agency are dwarfed in the processes of government, distancing the decisions from the consequences for the people. A similar and ominous distancing results from the enclosure of elements of the ecosystems that make up the common heritage of humankind, now enclosed, privatized, and the subject of chaotic speculative trading in paper claims by complicated corporate forms without moral responsibility either for current impact or for intergenerational stewardship. So it's interesting. I suggested an interesting topic for research to consider some possible distributional consequences of attempts to challenge these trends in ownership and rights. As distinct from all the claims, are you getting up? No. Okay. As distinct from all the claims of self-made men, common ownership of much of the built environment would suggest that there is some public claim on corporate profits from the production that's made possible by all of this public infrastructure, all the infrastructure assets that have been built out of the contributions of the community. More fundamentally, common ownership of the earth, or the ecosystems of the biosphere, would suggest a dominant public interest in the large profits, not just the small royalties that flow from drawing on those assets, some people call natural capital. And of course, issues of Aboriginal title or water rights become rather critical public policy issues here if you pursue that line of thought. Common ownership of the intellectual property that's accumulated as a result of the vast public investment in scientific research, post-secondary education, the publicly funded higher education research and development funds, would seem to argue for wider disclosure, greater access to, and greater capture for the public of more of the returns from innovation that are built upon that base. Who really owns that IP? Who gets to exploit it? A question that I think Ted wants to ask me. And who owns the robots that we build out of all that publicly funded research? Who should own those robots? So, interestingly, all of these considerations suggest increasingly strong justification for the introduction of some kind of significant citizens' income, basic income, participation income, income that flows as a result of being part of the community and part of the community for which many of the assets we're exploiting are a common heritage. It's the obvious way to address some of the crucial problems of increasingly unreasonable and unjustifiable inequalities of income and wealth and the resulting social conflicts. Some of the crucial social and institutional rebalancing that's essential here might be seen as flowing from the growing and fascinating movements promoting the case for human rights as against corporate personhood, pursuing indigenous rights and rights of nature, in some way building what some people think of as a UN-oriented global institutional architecture rather than the Bretton Woods system that's currently driving the world at the expense of the earth. All this could go either way, it seems to me. We could rethink these developments in ways that lead to participation income, to basic income, to citizen engagement, participatory democracy. Considering human rights and rights of nature, we could take measures offsetting the corporate claims, bringing social decisions back from the impartial tribunals of investor-state dispute settlement systems, which are intended precisely to be technical and divorced from any consideration of extraneous social considerations beyond politics, except, of course, for the politics of the money that drives them. We could move further toward the social economy, the community-based economy, or we could move still further toward the corporatist state that we seem at the moment inexorably to be building. Or maybe we'll take a step even further to distancing ourselves from the consequences of our decisions, delegating more to machines and software agents and friendly artificial intelligence, pursuing human well-being as signaled by what's called coherent extrapolated volition. So friendly artificial intelligence. There were a couple of recent articles, one in the New York Magazine, one in the New York Times, raised some interesting questions. They posed as real fears about this yet further layer in the delegation and distancing of profound public decisions. The first, which is a bit more expansive and speculative, but significant, is the literature on superintelligent entities, which were developed following a possible intelligence explosion to go along with the information explosion that we're already confronting. A New York Magazine columnist asked whether we should fear what Watson, Watson, the big blue machine that wins at Jeopardy, might become when he or she grows up. More particularly, what might happen if she moves toward becoming a really smart, recursively self-improving machine, even if she's friendly and working in the best interests of humanity. Indeed, one really interesting question is, how are we going to communicate to her what is really in the best interests of humanity globally? And then, of course, there's a question, who is going to own the returns from all the work she does? So that's just one version of the question, whether we can adequately deal with the development of friendly artificial intelligence driven by recursively self-improving machines. Maybe more immediately, and maybe more in the traditional realm of the Center for Global Studies, there's a New York Times article reported a while ago on intergovernmental discussions around possible need for regulation of the development of fully autonomous weapons, laws, lethal autonomous weapons systems. Some people call them killer robots. The people who have joined the social movements that are trying to promote controls of these things like to call them killer robots. Reports from a recent, and this is April 2015, meeting of the Informal Expert Committee on Laws in Geneva, suggest that outcomes of the discussion, outcomes of the process, hinge on the question, what might be meant by meaningful human control when it comes to these systems? If you take away the guys in Idaho that are controlling the drones, where does the human control come? Can we interpret it as sufficient to have had a human design the machine? Or do we have a bigger problem? Actually, NGO reports from that meeting indicated that the US and Israel were the two nations that refused to rule out further development of such weapon systems, despite a lot of calls for a ban or at least a moratorium. Well, let me come back once again to the matter of luck. The other really lucky thing in my career has been the continuing opportunity to work with extraordinary students. I take the examples from what you've just heard, but particularly now, when the system overall seems to be broken, both nationally and globally, it's often hard to be optimistic about where all this analysis has taken us. On the other hand, having the chance to be in the midst of all the energy and enthusiasm and imagination, and even still the idealism of the students and colleagues from earlier days and now around the Center for Global Studies, where I'm still tolerated, it's hard not to come back a bit optimistic about possibilities for a different future. We may be in an era of evidence-resistant reasoning, which steals a phrase from Trudy Gauvier, or opinion-based evidence formation, which extends right up to the appeal to the outright lie. There's still hope for change. There's a lot to work on. In closing my chapter in this book that we launched today, I was torn between using the words of the Joni Mitchell song, "I've seen clouds from both sides now, but still it's life's illusions I recall. I really don't know life or love at all." Torn between that and quoting the Szymborska poem that in the end I did use, reality demands, life goes on. In the high mountain passes, in the midst of all the wreckage of bombed out places, the wind blows hats off heads, and we cannot help but laugh. So in the end, I guess, we've got to pursue this earnest debate about the proper balance between the different processes that turn experience, built according to the customs of formal disciplines within the academy, or experience built through observation and life in the outdoors. Knowledge that's built either in the tower or in the yard. We've got to see how that experience can be brought into different forms of expertise and different interpretations of evidence that might, through democratic process, guide reasoned and responsible action accepted as legitimate. But perhaps at the same time, we have to recognize both that we really don't know life at all and that life goes on despite us. So thanks again for everything. I really do hope that you find something helpful and interesting in the book that emerged from all the hard work that Ted and Jody and the authors. I think the authors must have had a bad time dealing with Ted, from what I hear. But anyway, I hope that you find something interesting in the resulting product. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rod. Here, as in Ottawa 2 weeks ago, I'm going to say exactly the same words. You could not have provided a more perfect demonstration of how and why you have touched so many lives and careers with your work, and how and why you continue to attract so many enthusiastic, energetic, inquiring people to work with you. So thank you. We're ready to close now the formally scheduled proceedings. So thank you to our speakers today. Wonderful job. Thank you to Rod. Thank you to you for coming. Thanks also to our colleagues and partners who've contributed to the project and to today's events. Our dedicated, patient, and tolerant book authors. Yes, thank you. And the participants and supporters for the original workshop upon which the book was based, including Joy Weissmiller and Chris Corbett, who are here with us today. For financial support, Shirk in its generosity, and Professor John Langford for acting as the PI on the associated grant. Institutional support for the project from the beginning by the University of Victoria under its then Provost Jamie Castles, whom I now understand has now moved on to some other job. And our generous host today, the Center for Global Studies, under the leadership of its past, current, and acting directors, Gordon Smith, Oliver Schmidtke, and Martin Bunton, and for all the actual work that went into actually making the workshop, the administration of the subsequent project, and today's event happen, Jody Walsh and Jennifer Swift. I now invite you to stick around, socialize, enjoy the refreshments at the back, and we're going to continue to have a kind of an informally open mic for a few minutes. I understand Martin has offered to be the enforcer of appropriateness and brevity, and but for anyone who's here who'd like to offer any additional contributions or thoughts about Rod and his contributions, we invite you, but get up, move around, socialize, have a good time, and thank you again all for coming.